Hi guys, it's Allie, and today we are going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of a particular trope. As you might have guessed by the title of this video and what's on the whiteboard behind me, we're going to be talking about the hate-to-love romance. So let's get right into it. For those of you unfamiliar with this trope, the hate-to-love romance is a narrative device in which two characters begin a story disliking, or you might even say hating, one another, and end the story in a situation very different to that, where they like and even love one another. So, like many tropes, this can be done very well, very successfully. It could also be done very, very poorly, and one thing that separates this trope from others, in my opinion, is that you are incorporating a feeling of hate there, of extreme dislike with someone else. And to end the story with a romantic relationship, there is a lot of character development that needs to happen that other tropes like friendship to romance don't necessarily need to, they don't need to necessarily jump through the same hoops that a hate-to-love romance does. So I wanted to go over some particular examples of great hate-to-love romances and why I feel like they are so good, and also talk about some not-so-good hate-to-love romances, and I will explain to you why I don't think you should incorporate these kind of romances in your stories as you go forward writing your hate-to-love romances. So with all that said, let's get started off with the positives. One of the best, and certainly the most classic version of the hate-to-love romance is in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So this is a story that everybody already knows. A middle-class but poorer by comparison girl meets a very rich guy. Her pride and prejudice and his own pride and prejudice don't mix very well. They hate each other, and only through the events of the story do they come to understand and love each other. So classic tale as old as time, hate-to-love romance story. But what makes this particular story so effective, in my opinion, is that it includes two characters who have a dislike for each other because of their own internal conflict and their own internal flaws and misconceptions about the world. They're actually very compatible people. They are quite similar in a lot of ways. They're both prideful, and they also don't really enjoy the society that they are a part of. They kind of go off and do their own thing, and they also are very particular about their family dynamic. They are very protective of their families. So they have a lot of stuff in common. They're very compatible people, but their own presumptions about the world are the only thing getting in the way of their romance. So when all of that stuff goes away because of the events of the story, they are able to see, it is revealed how truly compatible they are. So that is my first do for hate-to-love romance, is to create characters who are actually genuinely compatible. They're people who could get along in real life. It's just that they, as individuals, have societal or personal misconceptions about the world and about other people that are causing that barrier to arise between them. And only through the events of the story can those walls be broken down and they can see how truly in love they are. This next example is going to contain some minor spoilers for Game of Thrones, so especially if you have not seen the first 2 episodes of the latest and last season, then you might want to skip ahead to whatever timestamp I will leave somewhere on the screen. And if not, then just continue going. This is technically not canonical, but I will be mentioning some events that occur, so whether or not you agree with me that this is truly hate-to-love romance, you might still not want the spoilers, so continue at your own risk. I am, of course, referring to Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones. So full disclosure, I have not read the books, so this is based purely on my opinions from the TV show, but I believe this pairing is the best example of a hate-to-love relationship since Pride and Prejudice, and I like it for very different reasons, and I will get into those in just a second, but I truly do think it is the best and probably the most perfect example of this trope done incredibly well. So let's get into a little bit of why I think that way. Brienne and Jaime are part of an ensemble cast. That is one of the features of Game of Thrones that I think is so cool. They have never met each other, but yet we know them intimately as individuals before they ever meet face to face. So we know that Brienne is honorable, she's shy, she is someone who is incredibly loyal, but she is also a woman, which means that she cannot be the one thing that she always wanted to be, which is a knight. And then we have Jaime, who is a knight. He is a member of the King's Guard, and yet he is not honorable. He incites the entire plot when he pushes Bran off of a tower. He's in an incestuous relationship with his sister, and he just does whatever the Queen tells him to do, not based on honor, but because it's what he was told to do. So these are completely opposite characters, one of whom has something that the other wants, and so we know for a fact that they are not going to get along when they meet. What ends up happening is that they change each other fundamentally. They improve upon one another. And that's not to say that that change is forced. It's not like, hey Jaime, you're a jerk, stop doing that please. It's more so that they annoy each other, they hate each other, and they do not get along in any way, shape, or form. They're kind of terrible to one another, especially Jaime towards Brienne. But through the events that occur, they need to work against a common enemy. That makes them bond, that makes them vulnerable around each other, and through that vulnerability, they start to inspire one another. And that inspiration sparks change in them as individuals. Brienne becomes more extroverted. She fights for what she believes in because without someone telling her what to do, she's now forced to start making those decisions for herself, and Jaime is a huge part of that. Jaime perhaps changes even more than Brienne, not perhaps, he definitely changes more than Brienne, because he goes from being someone who is very arrogant to being someone who is loyal and who is honorable and who would, last chance for spoilers, who would come to Winterfell, abandoning his sister and going against her wishes, to rejoin Brienne and ask her if he can fight under her leadership. So that is a huge change for Jaime. The lesson behind this kind of hate-to-love romance is that you have two characters who are on total opposite ends of the spectrum. If they met and nothing changed in their lives, they would never get along. They would not like each other, and they would have every reason to not like each other. They're not compatible. But through external circumstances, they are forced into a position that makes them bond, makes them vulnerable around each other, and makes them have to respect and honor the other person in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. Through that experience of having to work together, they take some kind of inspiration from one another and they improve as people. They become more compatible people and they grow to love one another. So this is a little different for the Pride and Prejudice one. It isn't a situation where they're already compatible people, they just need to get over some internal miscommunications and misrepresentations about the world. It's that they genuinely don't like each other and shouldn't like each other, and it's only through external circumstances that they could possibly be brought together. I could make an entire video just about how much I love this couple, but instead, we're gonna get into the don'ts. There's another quick disclaimer before I start talking about these iterations of this trope that I really do not like and do not recommend you include in your own writing. Please note that this is just my opinion, and if you love stories like this, then that's your cup of tea. Books are books, and you can like what you want to like, alright? On to the things I don't like. Starting off with perhaps the most common of the don'ts that I'm going to mention in this video is the plotline where usually an impressionable young girl falls in love with usually a more bad boy type guy who is genuinely an asshole and is sometimes even abusive or just generally toxic in one way, shape, or form. This is not to say that any story with a bad boy, innocent girl dynamic is inherently bad or toxic, because I think it can be done well. It's not the most problematic thing I've ever seen. But it is in dangerous waters when you add in the hate-to-love romance, because on a plot basis, a lot of these stories don't give a valid reason or a valid journey for these characters to go on that would make that change in relationship meaningful or make sense. To have characters start off disliking each other, like I said at the very beginning of the video, you need to have a pretty justified reason for why that relationship is going to change so drastically. And a lot of times in these type of stories, it comes down to they don't like each other, girl thinks guy's face is cute, guy reveals tragic backstory, guy doesn't change at all, but now girl loves him. And that is really the way that a lot of these stories go. And that is not just kind of toxic and gross, but also just not really effective storytelling. I'm not going to give a particular example for this one because, like I said, it is very, very common, and I don't want to call out any specific book, partly because it is such a widespread thing that I don't think it's fair to pick out one as just the embodiment of this issue, because there's so many that do it exactly the same way. So leave in a comment if you have a particular book that comes to mind, because we all know these books, we've all read these books, we've all been 13. So that is the lesson of this one, is to not create characters who don't have any reason to like each other or to make that shift. The other lesson to be taken from this particular type of story is that it's not fulfilling if only one character needs to change. It's much deeper and much more complex and interesting storytelling if you have something like the previous example that I gave regarding Game of Thrones, where both characters go through changes that are based heavily in the plot and character events of the story to make them both change and both become more compatible organically, not because either of them is trying to be better or to fix the other person. The next don't that I wanted to talk about was the scenario where the relationship is the direct effect of a forced power dynamic held over one's head by the other. So, for context, what I mean by this is that, of course, stories have differences in power levels, in class levels. There's plenty of like Princess and the Pauper stories and vice versa. And there's also stories where society is what stops the couple from getting together, like a Romeo and Juliet type scenario, for example. If you have a forced power dynamic, what I mean by that is your Stockholm syndromes, your kidnappings, your captures, your jailers, that kind of thing, where one character is in a clear position of power over the other and maintains that power over them for most of the story. So the best example of this would be like a Beauty and the Beast. And now I'm not saying that Beauty and the Beast is a terrible, problematic story. I could go through a bunch of reasons why I feel like Beauty and the Beast and most Beauty and the Beast retellings are okay. They're not like these terrible, problematic things, but there is a level where writers go a little too far with this, especially if they bring in historical stuff that includes marginalized groups. It's usually not done well at all, and ends up looking much more like a power fantasy being played out than it is an actual engaging relationship. Hating their captor or their slaver or whatever the situation may be, and then by the end of the book, for some reason, loving that person. You might be safer writing a book that uses some of those do's that we talked about before, because those are just so nice and fun to read about, right? So do those instead. Okay, now let's move on to the didn't want to include in either the do or don't section, but I do have a specific example for it, and some of you might be mad at me, but let's just talk about it anyway. The book that I am referring to, of course, if you've seen some of my tweets or my previous videos, is the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black. So I don't quite put this in a do or a don't category because I think it is something entirely separate from the hate to love romance. A lot of people really love the primary romance between Jude, our main character, and Cardan, who is a prince, fairy prince, and also her main love interest. So we see them hate each other, we see them do terrible things to one another, and they also seem to have an obsessive amount of lust for each other. That's not the same thing as a hate to love romance. If that was the intention, I would say this is a don't. It is not a good idea to have this story arc where hate plus lust equals love, because that's not true. Lust doesn't require any of the things that love does. Mutual respect, affection, trust. Lust doesn't require any of that. It just requires pure attraction on a physical scale. Just because these characters feel that way doesn't mean that they have a hate to love romance. At least not yet. I don't think that is the intention with these characters. I think they are meant to be unlikable, and I think they are meant to have this hate plus lust equals question mark romance. Currently, it is just kind of in the air, so take that as you will, but that's where I'm gonna leave that one. So that is it for me this week. I hope you guys have enjoyed my ramblings on this trope and what I like and dislike about certain uses for it. Let me know if there is another trope that you would want a similar do's and don'ts video like this about. There are so many tropes and I have so many opinions on them, so I would love to talk a little bit more about the writing perspective and how writers can use or not use this trope to their advantage. So I'd really like to know if there's another one that you would want to maybe make a little series about this. We'll see. So let me know in the comments below if you liked this video, give it a like, and if you like my content, do subscribe. I make videos every Friday, and I will see you all in the next video.